LeBron James. That fool only knows how to do commercials, count his money in Los Angeles, and live in another reality. Just give me $500 in cash right now, and I can completely wipe out your mandatory compliance fees.
A towering man sat in a dusty silver sedan outside his own premier sports complex, wearing an oversized gray hoodie and a faded black baseball cap. His legendary frame was slouched low against the worn fabric of the driver's seat, his large hands resting quietly on the steering wheel. Nobody glanced his way as they hurried through the blistering Phoenix heat toward the grand glass entrance of the facility. But what he was about to uncover over the next 48 hours would challenge the very foundation of the legacy he had spent decades building. From the outside, Apex Horizon Sports Academy looked like a temple of athletic achievement, boasting pristine indoor courts and state-of-the-art training gear. It was supposed to be a sanctuary, where raw talent mattered more than a family bank account. A place built specifically to give underprivileged kids a real shot at destiny. Yet the recent anonymous digital reviews had painted a much darker picture, whispering of predatory contracts, sudden administrative fees, and young dreams shattered at the signing table. One review from a heartbroken mother had kept LeBron awake for 3 consecutive nights, its final words burning into his conscience like a hot iron. "We trusted the name on the building, but they took our rent money and left my boy standing at the gate." LeBron reached into his pocket and squeezed a small, tarnished brass whistle, its metal surface worn smooth by years of friction. It belonged to his mother, a reminder of the days when a whistle and a basketball were the only wealth they possessed in the world. He took a slow, deliberate breath, adjusting the glasses that helped conceal his famous features under the shadow of his cap. Stepping out of the car, he adopted a heavy, hesitant walk, completely erasing the explosive grace that usually defined his movement. He was no longer the global icon. Today's Raymond, a quiet uncle looking for a basketball program for his nephew. As he crossed the threshold into the air-conditioned lobby, the immediate roar of sneakers squeaking on hardwood was cut short by a sharp, condescending voice. A sleek, middle-aged man in a tailored navy suit stood near the front desk, his gold signet ring catching the bright overhead fluorescent lights. Garrett Vance, the recently appointed regional director, radiated the kind of corporate arrogance that viewed human aspiration as a mere line item on a ledger. He was looking down at a young boy holding a scuffed basketball and a man whose hands were heavily calloused from years of manual labor. "I understand your boy has potential, Mr. Miller, but our elite development squad requires a mandatory facilities maintenance deposit before we can issue the jersey," Garrett said, his voice dripping with smooth, unyielding indifference. The father, Thomas Miller, flinched as he clutched a crumpled stack of documents against his chest, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and raw desperation. "But the coordinator told us on the phone that the scholarship covered everything," Thomas whispered, his voice cracking slightly under the weight of the public gaze. "We saved for 3 months just to afford the bus fare and the basic insurance fee." Garrett offered a cold, practiced smile that never reached his eyes, turning his back slightly to adjust his immaculate silk tie. "Phone conversations do not override signed corporate policy, and without the additional $1,200, the spot goes to the next child on the waiting list." The young boy, Chase, looked up at his father, his eyes pooling with tears, as he slowly lowered his basketball to the polished floor. The silence in the lobby grew thick and suffocating as several coaches and parents looked away, pretending to be buried in their phones to avoid the discomfort of the scene. LeBron stood just a few feet away near the water fountain, his face completely expressionless, his eyes locked onto the absolute defeat in the father's eyes. But nobody in that room understood what was actually written on that faded piece of paper yet. The heavy glass doors swung shut behind Thomas Miller and his son, cutting off the humid desert air and leaving them trapped in the clinical, high-stakes atmosphere of the lobby. The hum of the industrial air conditioning unit vibrated through the floorboards, a relentless mechanical drone that seemed to amplify the sudden, awkward silence of the room. High above the polished courts, massive banners bearing inspirational slogans hung frozen in the artificial breeze, their bold letters promising greatness to anyone who dared to sweat. Yet beneath the bright lights, the air felt thick with a different kind of tension, smelling less like fresh hardwood and more like stale coffee, expensive cologne, and corporate ambition. LeBron walked slowly toward the eastern court, his heavy work boots making a dull, thudding sound against the edge of the rubberized floor. He watched the daily routine of the academy unfold, observing how the initial warmth he had designed into this place had been replaced by a rigid, transactional coldness. At the far desk, a young receptionist named Tyler Evans sat with his shoulders hunched, his fingers flying across a computer keyboard with an anxious, erratic rhythm. Tyler kept his head down, his nervous blue eyes constantly darting toward the glass-walled upper office where Garrett Vance's shadow moved behind tinted windows. Every time a phone rang, the young clerk would flinch slightly, clearing his throat before delivering a perfectly rehearsed, sterile greeting about premium membership tiers. Across the main court, a group of wealthy parents sat on plush leather benches, their eyes glued to tablets rather than the children practicing free throws below. They wore matching designer athletic gear, their conversations centered around private coaching rates, regional rankings, and the financial cost of securing an athletic scholarship. Near the water cooler, two older coaches stood with clipboard in hand, their voices low and strained as they looked over the weekly attendance sheets. They did not talk about defensive rotations or player development. Instead, they argued about modern administrative quotas and the penalty for letting a kid play without a verified digital registration code. The entire vibrant ecosystem of the game had been squeezed into a series of strict financial checklists, leaving no room for raw passion. LeBron leaned his large frame against a padded pillar, pretending to check his phone while his eyes tracked every micro-interaction in the massive room. He noticed a secondary salesman named Reggie Blake walking the perimeter of the court, a smooth-talking man who wore a silver whistle around his neck like a trophy. Reggie approached a mother whose son was sitting on the bench with a slightly swollen ankle, his posture instantly shifting into a display of intense, manufactured concern. "We have a specialized immediate recovery therapy program that isn't covered by the standard tuition," Reggie murmured, his hand resting casually on the clipboard. "It is only $400 per session, but it guarantees he won't lose his starting spot before the talent scouts arrive next weekend." The mother looked down at her son's faded sneakers, her hand instinctively tightening around her small fabric purse as she calculated the unexpected cost. She nodded slowly, her expression a mix of profound guilt and heavy resignation, unable to look her child in the eye as she signed the additional authorization form. LeBron's grip tightened on the old brass whistle, hidden deep in his hoodie pocket, his knuckles turning white under the fabric. The facility was operating like a beautifully greased engine, but it was harvesting the anxiety of poor families to fuel its high profit margins. Every smile from the staff felt practiced, every encouraging word came with a hidden price tag, and the true spirit of the game was being suffocated by greed. The rhythmic, hollow thud of a basketball bouncing on the hardwood echoed through the cavernous gym, each strike of the leather sending a cold shiver down LeBron's spine. To anyone else, it was just the ordinary sound of an afternoon practice, but to him, it was a time machine that pulled him straight backward into the winters of Akron, Ohio. He leaned heavier against the padded pillar, letting his head drop slightly. As the smells of the modern facility faded, replaced by the ghost memory of cold wind rushing through a cracked window pane. He remembered a time when there were no bright lights, no expensive tailored suits, and no digital scoreboards tracking every breath a kid took. He remembered a tiny, poorly heated apartment where the radiator hissed through the night like an angry snake, and a mother who constantly checked the electricity meter with a worried frown. He was 12 years old again, standing in a cramped, drafty community gym that smelled of wet wool coats and cheap floor wax, his heart hammering against his ribs in pure excitement. His mother, Gloria, had spent 2 long years taking extra shifts at the local laundry facility, her skin rubbed raw by harsh chemicals, just to save enough for a single registration fee. She had walked through the snow to the neighborhood sports club, her face pale but determined, clutching a small envelope containing $300 in worn, crumpled bills. She had placed that money on the wooden counter, looking the program coordinator in the eye with a pride that could not be bought by any millionaire. It was his chance to play in the regional tournament, his first real opportunity to step onto a court, where talent scout might actually notice a kid on the outer edges of the city. Then came the cold, calculated shift in the coordinator's voice, a memory that still made LeBron's blood burn after all these decades of fame and success. The man behind the desk had barely glanced at the envelope before sliding a new piece of paper forward, pointing a blunt finger at a microscopic paragraph tucked beneath the main signature line. "This is just the basic club insurance, Ms. James. But the tournament jersey and the mandatory traveling referee fee will be an additional $150. Due today," the man had said, his face completely indifferent to the sudden terror in the mother's eyes. Gloria had frozen, her hand instinctively reaching into her empty pockets, her voice dropping to a desperate whisper as she pleaded for a temporary extension. But the man had simply reached out, taken the uniform shorts from the counter, and tossed them back onto a high shelf behind him, his gesture ending the dream with the casual flick of a wrist. They had walked back to their apartment in total silence that evening, the freezing Ohio air biting at their faces, as LeBron kept his eyes glued to his worn, mismatched shoes. He had pretended to be fine, pretending that he didn't care about the tournament. But when the apartment door finally clicked shut, the carefully maintained illusion collapsed. He had watched from the shadow of the narrow hallway as his mother sat down at the small kitchen table, burying her face in her scarred hands and weeping silently while she thought her son was safely asleep in the next room. She felt completely powerless, entirely defeated by a system that measured a child's right to dream by the thickness of his parents' wallet. It was during those dark, quiet hours of her heartbreak that LeBron had made a silent, unyielding vow to himself and to the universe. He had promised that if he ever made it out of that shadow, if he ever gained power and wealth, he would build a sanctuary where no child would ever have to look at their parent with that specific, devastating sense of shame. His large hand tightened around the old brass whistle in his pocket, the sharp metal edges digging deep into his palm to anchor him back to the present reality of the Phoenix facility. His mother had found that very whistle on a playground court months later, giving it to him as a token of her belief, telling him that a true leader always controls the tempo of the game with integrity. She had passed away before seeing this specific academy rise from the desert ground, never knowing that her worst night had become the blueprint for a multi-million-dollar sports foundation built to protect kids just like her son. The realization that a man like Garrett Vance was now using that very foundation to recreate the exact same trauma made LeBron's chest ache with a quiet, dangerous fury. He looked up, his eyes hardening under the rim of his baseball cap, as he watched Garrett enter the main court, the regional director's expensive leather shoes clicking loudly against the pristine wood. The afternoon sun shifted, throwing long, geometric shadows of the basketball hoops across the glossy floor of the main lobby. Thomas Miller walked back through the glass doors alone, his shoulders hunched even lower than before, his face pale and slick with sweat from the brutal Arizona heat. He walked with a desperate, heavy shuffle toward Garrett Vance, who was currently reviewing a digital ledger on a sleek tablet near the central trophy display. Thomas held a small plastic envelope containing a few crumpled 20s and an old silver watch, his hands trembling violently as he reached out. "Please, Mr. Vance, I managed to borrow 300 more from my brother, and I can leave this watch as a guarantee for the remaining balance. Until next payday," Thomas whispered, his eyes pleading for a shred of empathy. "My boy Chase has been sitting in the car crying, staring at his sneakers, because he thinks his dream is dead just because of me." Garrett did not look up from his tablet immediately, letting the silence stretch between them like a physical barrier for several agonizing seconds. He slowly adjusted his gold signet ring, a faint condescending smirk playing at the corner of his lips before he finally raised his cold gray eyes. "This is an elite athletic institution, Mr. Miller, not a local pawn shop or a charity clinic for families who cannot manage their household budgets," Garrett said, his voice loud enough to cut through the ambient noise of the entire lobby. "If we accepted old watches and empty promises, our courts would be filled with kids who belong in neighborhood recreational parks rather than competitive national circuits." He stepped closer, his tailored suit shifting crisply, his posture radiating a calculated disgust that made Thomas instinctively step backward. "Your son might have a decent jump shot, but premium training requires premium stability. And frankly, people from your background rarely possess the discipline to finish what they start here." The words cut through the room like a blade, causing two young coaches nearby to suddenly freeze mid-sentence, their clipboards lowering as they exchanged uncomfortable glances. A mother who was adjusting her daughter's gym bag stopped completely, her hand gripping the strap tightly as she looked down at the floor, unable to bear the cruelty unfolding right in front of her. The young receptionist, Tyler Evans, lowered his eyes, his knuckles turning white as he stared intensely at his blank computer monitor to avoid showing his shame. Thomas stood completely paralyzed, his face burning red under the harsh fluorescent lights, his fingers tightening around the worthless plastic envelope as tears of pure humiliation finally spilled down his weathered cheeks. He looked like a man who had worked his entire life to maintain his dignity, only to have it stripped away in a matter of seconds by an executive who viewed his poverty as a personal failure. LeBron stood perfectly still against the padded pillar just 5 feet away, his large frame cast in deep shadow, his face completely unreadable beneath the rim of his dark baseball cap. He absorbed every single word, every condescending tone, and every micro-reaction of the silent crowd, his heart pounding with a slow, heavy, and dangerous rhythm. His right hand remained deep inside his gray hoodie pocket, his fingers squeezing the old brass whistle so hard that the metal edge threatened to break through his skin. He did not step forward, he did not raise his voice, and he did not reveal his identity yet, knowing that the structural rot inside his academy needed to reveal its full, ugly depth before he could destroy it completely. The crowd's silent outrage hung heavy in the air, a thick blanket of collective discomfort that magnified Garrett Vance's absolute, unchallenged arrogance as the regional director turned back to his tablet, completely dismissing the broken father with a wave of his manicured hand. Thomas Miller slowly turned away from the central display, his hand wiping his wet eyes as he began his long, defeated walk back toward the exit. Garrett Vance did not waste a single moment celebrating his cruelty, turning immediately to Reggie Blake, the finance manager who had just stepped out of the back administrative hallway. Reggie carried a thick leather folder, his expensive silver whistle swinging gently against his chest as he flashed a dark, knowing smile toward his superior. "Did you clear out the afternoon schedule, Garrett?" Reggie asked in a low voice that easily carried across the quiet reception area. "We have 2 more families arriving from the wealthier suburbs at 4, and I already adjusted their entry tier to include the premium training insurance." Garrett nodded smoothly, tapping his tablet with an air of complete satisfaction. "They will pay without a single question, Reggie, because unlike these local workers, they understand the value of an elite brand name." LeBron watched the 2 men exchange a brief, transactional nod before he quietly stepped away from the padded pillar, his heavy boots making no sound as he approached the front desk. Tyler Evans was still staring at his blank monitor, his breathing shallow and uneven as he tried to process the humiliation he had just witnessed. LeBron leaned his massive arms against the high wooden counter, lowering his head slightly so the shadow of his baseball cap completely obscured his eyes. "Hey man," LeBron said, his voice carrying a thick, slow manufactured Texas drawl that sounded tired and worn. "That father who just left, does that kind of financial surprise happen to everyone who applies for the development squad here?" Tyler flinched violently at the sudden question, his honest blue eyes darting toward Garrett's glass office with pure, unadulterated terror. "Look, sir, I shouldn't be speaking about corporate policy," Tyler whispered, his voice trembling as he leaned forward over the counter to keep his words from carrying. "But Garrett, Mr. Vance, he has this entire system worked out with the regional office. We are forced to quote the base scholarship price over the phone to get these working-class families emotionally invested in their kids' futures." LeBron remained perfectly still, his right hand discreetly sliding his phone toward the edge of his hoodie pocket, activating the high-definition digital voice recorder. Once they arrive with their kids and see the courts, Garrett Pat brings out the mandatory facilities maintenance deposit and the administrative processing fees. Tyler continued, his eyes pooling with a sudden flash of guilt. "If we don't follow his script, he cuts our hourly shifts, reassigns us to the empty morning slots when no parents visit, and ensures we never earn our monthly performance bonus." LeBron nodded slowly, maintaining his slow, submissive Raymond persona, while the digital recorder captured every syllable of the young man's confession. "It sounds like a brutal way to run a sports program, son," LeBron murmured, keeping his tone gentle to encourage the clerk to dig deeper. "It is worse than brutal. It is a complete scam," Tyler added, his voice dropping to a desperate rasp. "A coach named Devin Wright tried to report this directly to the main foundation headquarters in California last month because he refused to lie to a family from the lower side of town. Garrett found out within 24 hours, accused Devin of stealing athletic equipment from the locked storage bay, and fired him on the spot without a single reference. Now nobody dares to speak up, because we all have rent to pay, and Garrett keeps a file on every single one of us to ensure absolute compliance." The digital clock on the wall of Garrett Vance's private office clicked to 4:15 p.m., its red numbers glowing against the dark mahogany wood paneling. LeBron walked slowly into the room, his large frame slouched as he stepped onto the expensive plush carpet, his hand still buried inside his hoodie pocket. Garrett sat behind his glass desk, adjusting his gold signet ring while sipping from a ceramic mug that bore the Academy logo. He looked up, his cold gray eyes instantly assessing the worn clothes and the faded cap of the man standing before him. "Well, Raymond, was it?" Garrett said, his voice dropping into a smooth, transactional purr that he used for closing difficult deals. "Tyler mentioned you had some lingering questions about our development squad contract before you committed your nephew to the program." LeBron took a slow step forward, looking at the framed management certificates and regional sales trophies that lined the office shelves like a wall of plastic armor. "Yeah, I was just out there in the lobby. And saw what happened with that worker Thomas, LeBron said, adding a heavy, hesitant drawl to his natural voice. It looked like he got hit with a lot of extra fees at the last second, and I'm just a simple working man myself. I need to know if the price we talked about on the phone is the real price, or if you're going to twist my arm too once my boy gets his heart set on playing here. Garrett leaned back in his leather chair, a slow, condescending smirk creeping across his face as he locked his fingers behind his head. Let me be entirely straight with you, Raymond, because I can tell you're a practical man who understands how the world actually works, Garrett said, his tone dripping with an arrogant, self-righteous confidence. This facility isn't actually about teaching kids how to bounce a leather ball on a wooden floor. It is about selling an illusion of destiny. People walk through those front doors desperate for a way out of their ordinary lives, and my job is to show them exactly how much that escape route costs. The owner of this entire foundation, LeBron James, is thousands of miles away in Los Angeles, filming commercials, counting his millions, and living in a completely different reality. He hasn't set foot in this regional branch in over 2 years, and as long as our monthly revenue reports show a 40% increase, he stays exactly where he belongs. LeBron remained perfectly still in the center of the room, his phone recording every single word from the edge of his pocket as the regional director continued to dig his own grave. So the owner doesn't care that you're turning away poor kids who actually have the talent to play, LeBron murmured, keeping his voice low and submissive to feed the manager's ego. Garrett laughed outright, a sharp, hollow sound that echoed off the glass walls of the office as he stood up to pace near the window. LeBron James is a businessman, Raymond, and business is dictated by numbers, not by emotional neighborhood bedtime stories about Akron, Ohio, Garrett sneered, waving his manicured hand dismissively toward the courts below. I buried the only complaint that ever tried to reach corporate headquarters so deep in administrative paperwork that it will never see daylight, and I fired the coach who wrote it. Garrett walked back to his desk, leaning over the glass surface as his eyes narrowed into a sharp, predatory glare. But I like you, Raymond, so I'm going to offer you a specific, one-time executive accommodation to make this easy for both of us. The $1,200 facilities deposit is completely mandatory on paper. But if you slip me $500 in cash right now, I can make that digital requirement vanish from your nephew's file. Think of it as a small private investment in ensuring your boy gets placed on the starting roster without any bureaucratic headaches. LeBron stared down at the desk for a long, quiet moment, the air in the room suddenly turning freezing cold as the silence stretched between them like a tight wire. He reached into his pocket, but instead of pulling out a wallet, his large fingers wrapped around the tarnished brass whistle, his hand drawing it into the light. He stood up straight, his slouched posture completely vanishing as his massive shoulders squared, his entire physical presence shifting into the commanding, unyielding stature of a global icon. Garrett's smile instantly froze on his face, his gray eyes widening in sudden, confused shock as the man before him reached up and slowly removed the black baseball cap. The long shadow of LeBron James fell heavily across the glass desk, his natural, authoritative voice cutting through the quiet room like a strike of thunder. I think we need to discuss your actual employment status, Garrett, LeBron said, his eyes locking on to the regional director with a terrifying, quiet intensity. Garrett stumbled backward, his leather chair rolling violently into the mahogany wall behind him as his perfect white teeth began to chatter in pure, unbridled terror. Merce James, Garrett stammered, his face turning an ash-gray color as his hands shook so hard he knocked his ceramic mug onto the floor, the coffee pooling dark across the carpet. I can explain everything, sir. That was just standard sales talk. It was completely taken out of context. LeBron simply raised his phone, pressing a single button on the screen as Garrett's own arrogant voice filled the small office through the digital speaker. LeBron James is a businessman, Raymond, and business is dictated by numbers. I buried the complaint so deep it will never see daylight. The regional director stared at the device, the realization of his catastrophic mistake crashing through his mind as the sweat broke across his forehead, his corporate armor completely shattered in a matter of seconds. LeBron did not waste another second looking at the trembling manager. He stepped past the glass desk, reached for the central administrative intercom console on the wall, and flicked the master switch. His voice, deep and resonant, echoed through every corner of the massive sports complex, cutting through the squeak of sneakers and the rattle of basketball rims. All staff, coaches, and management report to the main lobby immediately, LeBron announced, his tone flat and unyielding. This is an emergency freeze on all facility operations. Down in the lobby, a suffocating silence fell, as Garrett Vance was led out of his private office by LeBron, followed closely by Reggie Blake, who had been intercepted by senior security guards near the back exit. LeBron held his phone directly to the microphone of the reception desk, pressing play on the digital recording. Garrett's arrogant, recorded voice filled the entire cavernous room, broadcasting his scheme about manufactured deposits, hidden fees, and his utter contempt for the working-class families of Phoenix. With every word that played, the atmosphere in the room grew heavier, the air turning cold as the gathered coaches and parents listened in absolute disbelief. Several newer sales representatives lowered their heads in deep shame, unable to look at the crowd, while the older coaches clenched their fists in silent anger. Tyler Evans stood near the computer terminal, a massive wave of relief washing over his young face as he saw the corporate shield of his abusive bosses shatter in real time. LeBron turned his gaze to Garrett, whose expensive tailored navy suit now looked crumpled, sweat pouring down his pale face as two local police officers, called minutes earlier, stepped through the grand glass entrance. Your 40% revenue increase was built on extortion, fraud, and the systematic destruction of human dignity, LeBron said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper that carried across the frozen lobby. You didn't just break the financial policy of this foundation. You weaponized the desperation of parents who just wanted to give their children a fair chance at life. Reggie Blake's face crumbled completely as an officer reached for a pair of metal handcuffs, clicking them firmly around the finance manager's wrists. "Mr. James, please, I was just following regional directives," Reggie stammered, his confidence evaporating into the air-conditioned room. Garrett Vance did not screech or fight back. Instead, he stood completely rigid as the handcuffs snapped around his own wrists, his eyes staring blankly at the polished hardwood floor. The sheer, crushing weight of his catastrophic mistake seemed to age him by 10 years. In a matter of his arrogant smirk, his arrogance by a hollow, sickening realization of his total ruin. He looked up at the massive banners hanging from the ceiling, then at the silent, judgmental eyes of the coaches he had bullied, finally understanding that his corporate power was an absolute illusion. As the officers guided him toward the exit, his leather shoes dragged heavily against the floor. A broken man who had traded his humanity for a temporary bonus tier, only to lose his career, his reputation, and his freedom. 2 weeks passed, and the scorching desert wind outside the facility seemed to clear away the heavy, suffocating cloud that had hung over Apex Horizon Sports Academy. Inside, the massive glass upper office remained completely dark, but the central lobby was more vibrant and alive than it had been in years. LeBron did not return to his corporate headquarters. Instead, he set up a simple wooden desk right near the main entrance, personally reviewing every single contract signed during Garrett Vance's destructive tenure. Massive digital screens now lined the walls above the reception desk, flashing clear, transparent numbers that outlined the GAC's tuition costs with a bold, simple statement. No hidden deposits, no processing fees, true development for every child. Tyler Evans sat at his station with his chest held high, his hands steady as he processed a stack of new, honest applications without a single trace of fear in his eyes. He looked up as a familiar man stepped through the glass doors, carrying a whistle around his neck and a clean clipboard in his hands. Devin Wright, the coach who had been fired and slandered by Garrett for protecting a poor family, walked onto the court to a sudden, spontaneous burst of applause from the younger trainers. LeBron stood up from his simple desk, walking over to shake Devin's hand firmly, welcoming him back not just as a coach, but as the newly appointed Director of Athletic Integrity and Player Advocacy. Your job is to make sure we never measure a kid's heart by the color of his money again. Devin, LeBron said, his voice carrying a warm, deep resonance that made several parents nearby smile. The most profound transformation, however, took place in the Academy's conference room, which had been turned into a dedicated space for structural restitution. LeBron spent hours personally calling families who had been forced out or exploited by the previous management, offering sincere apologies and full financial refunds. One afternoon, Thomas Miller and his son Chase walked back into the facility, their eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and quiet wonder as they saw the changes. Chase was immediately greeted by Coach Devin, who handed the boy a brand-new, official Academy jersey with his name printed neatly across the back. LeBron walked over to Thomas, his massive hand resting gently on the father's weathered shoulder, his expression filled with a deep, human respect. Your boy belongs on this court, Mr. Miller, and his full scholarship is locked in with zero surprises, LeBron murmured, his voice softening. We failed you, but we are going to make it right. One honest connection at a time. Thomas looked at his son, who was already running toward the court, with a massive smile, and let out a long, shaky breath, the heavy weight of humiliation finally lifting from his soul. The long desert dusk slowly settled over Phoenix, painting the wide Arizona sky in deep shades of amber and violet. Inside the now quiet facility, the bright overhead fluorescent lights were turned off, leaving only the soft evening glow to reflect off the pristine hardwood of the main court. LeBron stood alone near the center circle, his massive frame casting a long, peaceful shadow across the polished wood where so many young feet had run that day. The heavy silence of the gym was no longer suffocating. It felt calm, restored, and deeply rooted in a purpose that money could never buy. He reached into his gray hoodie pocket and pulled out his mother's old brass whistle, letting it rest in his open palm under the fading light. The metal was cool against his skin, a small, humble anchor that had survived the harshest winters of Ohio to remind him exactly who he was when the cameras stopped rolling. He walked slowly toward the front display glass, where a new, modest wooden plaque had been placed right beside the championship trophies. On its surface, a simple phrase was engraved in bold, clean letters. Talent is given, trust is earned, and every human being deserves a fair whistle. LeBron looked at the words for a long moment, a quiet, genuine smile finally softening his tired face as he tucked the brass whistle safely back into his pocket. He turned, walked through the grand glass doors, and stepped out into the cool evening air under a canopy of desert stars. He did not look back at the building, knowing the foundation was finally secure, built on a promise that would outlast his own name. "Thanks, Mom," he whispered into the quiet night air, his voice barely louder than the breeze.